under environmental and social topics, but often people forget one of the biggest ones is the governance, and that's often where you're going to have a lot of your financial risk is in some of your governance protocols. And so for us, it has been able to provide some level of transparency to our various stakeholders that are looking to either choose us as a financial provider, choose us as an organization to invest in, or even choose us as a place to do business with or as an employer. So lots of stakeholders that we're trying to satisfy with sustainability reporting, but really trying to provide some mostly transparency into things that are not found in traditional reporting.
All right, and then I'll hopefully be able to jump in and provide a little bit of a counterpoint to Michael. So I work for the Illinois Treasurer's Office on our sustainable investment team, and sustainability is definitely not going away from the work that we're doing. We're very committed. Sustainability gets integrated across our entire investment process. And I wanted to start out giving you a quick overview of what the Illinois Treasurer actually does, because I'm aware not everyone knows the Treasurer. So the Illinois Treasurer is an elected position, and he serves as the Chief Banking and the Chief Investment Officer for the Illinois state. Not only do we invest $36 billion on behalf of the Illinois state, but we also run the 529 College Savings Program for the Illinois state, which I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with. We also have a retirement plan for employers in Illinois with under 100 employees, and we invest around $9 billion on behalf of other state agencies and municipalities in Illinois. So a total of $65 billion that we invest at the Illinois Treasurer's Office. And we sit on both sides of the equation, so we prepare a sustainable investing report annually. That's not mandated, that's a voluntary annual report. But we also integrate sustainability across our office. And we do this because we believe that sustainability and considering sustainability information in our process leads to better long-term financial returns of our investment. I'll also say that the financial equation and the importance of financial impact of sustainability factors is our driving factor. So we really look for sustainability information that has the potential to impact a company's performance. And that's really important. We all care about sustainability, but we're really interested in ensuring the long-term performance of our portfolio companies. And we also use sustainability reports by companies and their information for our corporate engagement program. So for publicly listed companies, we engage certain companies on their sustainability practices to encourage better long-term practices, to encourage them to adopt better processes and better practices that lead to long-term sustainable performance. So that can be a lot of different issues. We look at workers' rights, we look at how they manage their workforce, how they work with unions, we look at water scarcity and how they use water resources in their business model, but also net zero plans, all things related to climate, and like you said, corporate governance. So those are all pieces of information that's important for us for our corporate engagement program, and that we also consider when we vote proxies for our companies. So there's a lot of different ways that we consider sustainability information and integrate it into our processes, and it's definitely not going away and not something that we shy away from.
Thank you for that. I think it's important that all panelists just expressed how they were coming to the table so that you can all understand the different perspectives that we have represented here. So to dive in, as we look to the future, it's important to look at the past a bit and see how sustainability reporting has evolved. And Professor Wei, I would like to ask you, how has sustainability reporting evolved in academic, and Jamie, in corporate practices, and what trends do you believe are shaping its future?
Well, do you have my slides on? No, but that's fine. So sustainability reporting has grown substantially over the past decades. Let me share some statistics here. Back in 2010, only 38% of companies in the S&P 500 had a sustainability or ESG report. By 2020, that number jumped to 76%. So that's a huge increase. To understand the current landscape of sustainable reporting, I like to think in terms of a few key questions. The first one is, who is the audience? As you can tell from early discussions, there are two different views. The first view is reporting is mainly for shareholders. That's called shareholder primacy view or investment view. So under this view, and a lot of asset under management start to incorporate ESG factor in their portfolio choices. And some numbers here. And so the ESG funds rose from $2.4 trillion in 2012 to over $6 trillion in 2022. That's a huge increase. On the other hand, you have also seen from the panelists, some people also think the reporting should address broader communities. That's called stakeholder view. So the audience should not only include shareholders, but also employees, customers, suppliers, regulators, and the broader community. So that's called the stakeholder view. So currently there are two views, and depends on where you come from, you may pick a different views. That's the first question. The second question is, I forgot. So what gets measured and reported? It also depends on what standards companies are following. So for example, the standards issued by SASB, which is now part of ISSB, International Standard Sustainability Standards Board, they take the shareholder perspective. So they focus on financially material metrics that matter for investment purpose. They tailor those metrics for each industry. However, other standard setters, for example, Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, as well as the new European Sustainability Standards Board, they take the stakeholder view. They encourage firms to disclose information that may not be directly financially important for investing purpose, but have broader environmental social impact. So the different views, different standards, depend on which companies follow the standard, which is reported. Some firms issue standalone sustainability reports. Others incorporate the ESG content in their annual reports. So that's the value for the report. The big players are generally long Big Fours. Sorry about that. With Big Four firms, by 2020, their market share is around 20%. But with all the new regulations, I believe the booming markets have many opportunities for the assurance companies. And finally, is about enforcement. When we talk about reporting, it's always enforcement is part of it. So we all know that greenwashing, which means that firms issue misleading or exaggerate statements about their ESG activity, is a growing concern. Many firms, even though they publish sustainability reports, they use very vague boilerplate language, which doesn't have much more meanings. So we have all these problems. We have seen that. However, the enforcement on sustainability reported issues do occur. For example, SEC fined Goldman Sachs for their misleading sustainability statement about incorporating ESG factor in the investment. We do have some cases, but overall, by now, enforcement on ESG reporting or disclosure is less prevalent compared with enforcement on the traditional financial reporting side. So that's a very long discussion. I'm sorry for taking so much time. I think I should stop here and let others chime in. And if there's time, I can circle back to talk about future trend in later conversations.
Yeah, no need to apologize. It's very informative. But yeah, Jamie, we'd love to hear it from your perspective as well.
I agree with everything the Wei said. Just some terminology, I guess, as I take you on a little journey. I think maybe 15 years ago, corporations at least, were probably releasing reports that they call corporate citizenship reports, and I take you back there because I think that the terminology has always been challenging. Corporate citizenship today probably sounds a little weird, especially things that are going on here in North America. Who gets to determine what the definition of citizenship is? And so corporations moved away from that. And by the time I started in this space, we were probably calling them corporate social responsibility reports. And I will say when citizenship reports were being released, it was probably what you were doing for the community. Maybe you talked a little bit about some things you may have been doing with your. A lot of institutions, especially banks, probably felt like we had to have a way to tell a story that other than what was being told about us in the media back then. And so 2008 was when you probably saw a lot of financial institutions, 2008 to 2010, financial institutions putting out corporate social responsibility reports and using frameworks such as the Global Reporting Initiative that Wade mentioned earlier. And I think that journey was able to have a good, long, almost 10 years, and then people, as the rise of a Larry Fink at BlackRock, and investors started to really come out and talk about the importance of some of these things and their investment strategies. Even though the terminology ESG had been around as a risk or part of investment strategies for years, it seemed like an opportunity for a lot of firms to start to move into that ESG report, so that you started seeing people shift from corporate social responsibility reports to ESG reports. I think ESG reports may have had like a 3-year stint, to be honest, because it quickly became, again, another controversial term that you couldn't say. I also think around that time you started to see some different frameworks pop up. SASB, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. Again, more voluntary frameworks. Global Reporting Initiative still probably the most popular, the one that you're going to see used the most amongst Fortune 500 companies. But investors were actually really pushing to see companies that they invest in use the SASB. SASB gave us the opportunity, or gave investors, I think at the time, the opportunity to do a lot more benchmarking. And so there was a category, and that you reported the things that were in that category that SASB identified for you. So if you're a custody bank like myself, you report as a custody administrator. You don't necessarily report maybe not all the same disclosures as a Bank of America that's not considered a custody bank. So even amongst financial institutions, SASB created a framework that allowed for different industries to report the same information, and for the stakeholders that were looking for that to have a way to see similar information across the board. If you go back again to GRI, which is the popular one, you do your own materiality assessment and you determine what is material to your organization. SASB came around and said, okay, Northern Trust or Bank of New York Mellon or State Street, those are my peer banks. You guys all need to, we want to see this same level of information across the board. And so that was, I guess, somewhere between 2018 probably and 2022, you probably saw a lot of SASB reports coming out. And because of the terminology around ESG, I think that you saw companies start to change to sustainability, thinking that it was a safe term. We know that is probably not going to be a safe term for a long period of time, but what we also heard Wade say is what you see in a lot of corporations outside of North America, and I think we assumed at one point North America was trying to move into this direction, is maybe we don't need separate reports anymore. Maybe this information, it is time to integrate this. And so I still believe that the next phase won't be a new term for this type of report, that we will get to a place where this report becomes part of the traditional financial reporting, your annual reporting that goes out, because your stakeholders are all looking for this information. It's just not one particular stakeholder anymore that wants this. It's not a separate stakeholder that's looking at your 10K, that's looking at your sustainability or ESG report. They are starting to become one and the same that are looking for and comparing and looking for the differences, what you're going to release in your 10K and what you may not have said in your 10K and what you say that now in your sustainability report or your ESG report that's coming out. So again, I think it evolved from corporate citizenship. I think the language has always been a challenging one to keep up with, but I think the direction of travel is that this information that is being released is information that lots of stakeholders need to make different decisions about an organization, and it probably will get to the place where it's no longer separate reporting.
Thank you for that. So for the audience, we just heard an academic perspective and a corporate perspective from the Northern Trust. And as a student, I just invite you all to lean in. What an incredible opportunity to have such a diverse panel, to hear your perspectives and to bring them all together. So please know this is a conversation, not a presentation, and I encourage you to submit your questions for our panelists. So with that, let's look at the investor and asset owner perspective to build upon this academic and corporate understanding. So Karin, I'd love to begin with you. So in your role, how do you use sustainability reports in decision making? And which elements are the most critical for your evaluations?
Yeah, definitely happy to touch on that. So I talked a little bit already about our corporate engagement program that we have. And sustainability reporting is really important for us for that program because it helps us decide which companies we want to engage, but also how we want to vote our proxies at the annual meetings for those companies. So a lot of times at annual meetings, all shareholders come together, and if you hold a certain amount of shares, you can submit a shareholder proposal that other shareholders in the company get to vote on. Those are often voluntary, but they start really good conversations with the company, and the more support your proposal might get, the more likely the company is to take it up and to start working on those issues that you're flagging. And those are often sustainability related. So we have right now a lot of proposals that are pro-DEI programs, and then a lot of proposals that are questioning the validity and the utility of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So shareholders get a chance to vote on those. If we evaluate a proposal like that, we might look at what's included in your sustainability report on your diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. Or sometimes there's proposals related to a net zero plan. The company has a net zero plan, and we want to know how are you progressing on that. So that might be a proposal. And then I would look and see how well is the company performing on their progress towards net zero. Are they disclosing any information about that? If not, maybe then the proposal is valuable for me as an investor to learn more about their sustainability practices. So that's one way that we use sustainability disclosure by companies. I'll say for us, what's really important is quantifiable metrics that are comparable across companies. And like you already touched on, I think that's why SASB is really useful. That's why other global standard setters can be really useful, because if you want to compare company performance, if you don't have the same metrics, it's really, really hard to do that, right? And without, especially in the US, without mandated disclosure, we are left with a system where companies are looking for ways to disclose, and they have a lot of leeway. So that's why we have programs where we encourage companies to disclose certain pieces of information consistently. We always ask for the EEO-1 report, which provides information about workforce diversity that every company with over 100 employees has to already prepare. So it's a quick and easy, well, maybe not so easy, but it's a cost-effective disclosure because it's already being prepared by companies. So for us, what's really important, like I said, if you want to compare companies to each other, if you want to see who the leaders are, who the laggards are, you need disclosure that's comparable. Yeah, like I said, comparable disclosure is best. We also look beyond just sustainability reporting. We'll also look at TCFD reports, CDP reports, standalone net zero strategies are really interesting for us. But we also look at company proxy statements. That way you can often find information about the corporate governance. How is the board run? Who sits on which committee? What's the markup of your board? Are they diverse? Do they have diverse skill sets? Do they have a person who is an expert on sustainability related issues? All of that's information that's relevant and important for us. And then on the other side, we also review sustainability practices and reports of the asset managers that we invest with. So we don't make all of our investment decisions internally. We often outsource that to external asset managers, for example, like a Northern Trust. And we want to know and evaluate how they consider sustainability in their investment processes and across their firms. What are they doing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example? And those are all areas where quantitative metrics can be really important. Yeah, that's a quick overview of why and how we use sustainability disclosure.
Thank you for that. Michael, is there anything that you would add to that? And I can repeat the question if you'd like.
Yeah, I would say a lot of what Karin just said I agree with. largely speaking from the perspective of someone that's investing in public markets. So, you know, having something that's quantifiable is important. You know, I mean, I kind of approach everything typically from, you know, the data that we're working with to build models and construct portfolios. You know, as a scientist, I like data that I actually can record with an instrument, something that, you know, there's not a whole lot of variability between the data. The data integrity is to the point where I feel comfortable using it, and it's, you know, I can build it into a repeatable, systematic process. That being said, I don't use it to recommend individual names to invest in. I think, you know, for reasons I'll talk about in a second, you know, and I think you probably alluded to this a little bit, Karen, is really as a relative performance metric, right? So you look at sectors, or you look at, you know, even you could almost take a sector agnostic approach, but we're not going to just rank all the companies and say, okay, that, you know, those companies that have the highest score are the, you know, those are the investable opportunities. But we can at least get a sense for within sectors or within subsectors, you know, what are the names that tend to be bending the curve in the right direction. So we're taking a longer horizon. So it's not typical kind of high frequency trading in and out. We're actually looking to, you know, invest capital as opposed to trade capital. So, you know, in doing so, you know, we're looking at, you know, groups of names within sectors, typically dirty sectors, you know, those that have, you know, the most room for improvement. And, you know, as far as, you know, which framework to use, one that I tend to gravitate towards, and everyone has their own, but, you know, I really focus on SBTI, which is Science-Based Targets Initiative, which really allows, you know, as an investor, me to visualize what is the pathway to reducing emissions. And I always, you know, I apologize for focusing on emissions, because most of my work really focuses on the intersection of climate, energy, and agriculture, and emissions is a big part of that broad investor spectrum. But I'm not going to recommend a name, but, you know, we will look towards, you know, who are those companies that look like they're deploying capital in a way that can, you know, flatten that curve a little bit. Now, you know, the flip side of that is, and this is where I think there's a big opportunity, I still don't think we're using the right data to answer a lot of these questions. So I think if there's an opportunity on either the data provider side or the asset owner side, you know, are we really trying to match the right data that we have with the right questions? So 5 years ago, you know, this was, I wouldn't say this industry is mature, but when it was earlier days in this space, you know, the issue was not enough data and trying to stitch together all these different data sets to even ask coherent questions. You know, what does a cash flow model look like, or what does an investable thesis look like over 5, 7, 10 years? We kind of have the opposite now. We have, it's a better problem, but it still is, it's an equally challenging problem, if not more challenging problem. We have so much data, we don't really know which data to use. And again, going back to my earlier point, it's much easier to look at emissions data or wastewater effluent data, you know, or data that has, you know, a physical construct around it. But when we look about what embeds sustainability, it's a lot harder to put a quantifiable metric on, you know, board diversity or equity. You know, these are things that are, for different reasons, they're actually very, as a data scientist, they're very interesting questions, because they're, you know, these are really thorny issues that there's no black and white answer. But instead of using it as a, you know, driving the investment decision, it's really more as a factor investor, and this is one factor among several other factors. And, you know, a very, you know, I don't want to go too deep on any one topic, but, you know, the DEI one is really interesting, because a lot of companies are looking just at boards, right? And if you have a diverse board, you know, that tends to rate as a higher score. What we actually found when we started to look at some of these names is it wasn't necessarily the board, but it was the level right below the board. And so you might, you know, there were companies that were kind of, you know, from a public-facing perspective, having a more broad, diverse board, and that's what the public sees. But those necessarily, you know, were not necessarily the people that are affecting change within the company. So what we actually found is it didn't really matter what the board itself looked like, but that level right below the C level, you know, the people that are actually driving the business and that are steering teams towards doing things that are, you know, embedded in value appreciation, you know, there was actually a better metric in terms of returns, but there isn't really a good DEI score, or, you know, there wasn't a data provider that was providing data that was analogous to what that level looks like. So I think, you know, for any of you that are in the data side, you know, there's a, you know, we're just scratching the surface in terms of what data should be figured into an investment portfolio, and I think these are the kind of questions that we really need to be thinking about. And there's no shortage of questions. I mean, we could stop today and have enough questions to keep us busy for the next 100 years, right? So, you know, it's interesting and it's overwhelming at times, but I think we really need to, you know, sometimes it's easy to kind of have these investor blinders on, but, you know, we really need to kind of broaden the aperture and think about what does the data really mean, how is it reflected within business, and, you know, going back to the earlier example, that might be fine in one sector, but it's not fine in another sector. So these investor frameworks that are trying to be applied across an entire portfolio, I think that weighting structure needs to be reevaluated, and it almost needs to be a bespoke case-by-case basis, or else we're going to be, we're going to wind up doing one of two things. One, we're going to be answering, the right questions with the wrong data, or we're going to be building models that are right for the wrong reason. And at some point, both of those will blow up a portfolio.
And I can maybe jump in with another example, and I relate to a lot of what you're saying. For us, sustainability is also one factor in our investment process. It's hardly ever the main driver of our decision making. We do have a private markets portfolio where we have an impact focus, so there it's a little bit more prevalent and a bigger part of the investment decision making process. But on the data side, one project that I'm working on is on health and safety. So health and safety is shown to be relevant to companies' financial performance pretty much across the board, but there are certain sectors where it has a particularly big impact, or where there are a lot of health and safety issues. And I'm working with a data provider to aggregate OSHA data by industry, because I don't really want to look at all companies, let's say in the S&P 500, how they're performing in health and safety. What I want to know is, within your industry, are you a company that's improving? Are you a company that's standing out for particularly good or bad OSHA data? And some companies disclose OSHA data, but I'm able to go a lot more granular. So for example, with this data provider, I can look at inspections. How many inspections has the company had over the last 12 months? And how does that compare to the previous year? How severe were your violations that were found? How big are the fines that you're getting? And how does that compare to fines that other companies within your industry are getting? So those are the kinds of things that I want to look at when it comes to data and disclosure. And I think on the flip side, if you're a company, you probably don't want to disclose all of that information, but then someone like me is left with seeking out a data provider that's going to aggregate that information for me, and the company doesn't have an opportunity to weigh in and say, hey, actually our metrics are looking different. How are you aggregating that information? Why did you calculate it this way and not that way? Or, hey, you missed something here that we consider really important. So I think in some ways it can also be really helpful. If I was a company, I'd rather publish my own accurate data than to have investors go to a data provider that's going to do it manually and doesn't know about your business model and
not to
relies on
belabor this
OSHA
point,
data.
but this goes back to Jamie's early point, is all roads kind of lead to governance anyway, right? So if you're doing all these things in a way that's accretive to value, it should be reflective in how the company's governed, right? So you have all these other metrics, but if you want to wrap it into one score, typically you would think, or at least hope, it is the governance score, right?
Thank you both for that. Okay, moving on to the next question. We wanted to dive into the key challenges and barriers for effective sustainability reporting, and you both already touched on that a little bit. There's so much data, and it's a matter of having the right data. But Emily, I would love to invite you into the conversation. From your perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Marissa. So I spend most of my time working with both audit and non-audit clients of ours that are preparing sustainability reporting, requesting assurance, and now more and more, given all the regulation that's coming out and increased standard setting, really supporting companies as they're moving more into that from a voluntary reporting space into that increased regulatory reporting space. So in that light, I would say there's really two, I think, biggest challenges and most frequent challenges that I see. One is around the timeliness of reporting. When you think about regulatory reporting timelines, we were just talking earlier about this being kind of the season for sustainability reporting right now. Typically around 6 months after year end or so is typically when companies are publishing their voluntary sustainability reports. But in the regulatory space, the deadlines are going to be, I would say, generally more aligned with financial reporting, which not always, but typically tends to be a little bit more accelerated. And so I'm seeing companies figure out ways to accelerate their reporting process to be able to report and get assurance, because which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, in a lot of cases these regulations are now requiring assurance. So really looking to see how they can accelerate the timeline by getting data quicker, or if that's not possible, coming up with reasonable estimates to be able to report faster. The second challenge I would mention, although I won't belabor it, I'll maybe talk about a slightly different angle of it, is around data and data quality. which I know we've talked already quite a bit about the concept of data in general, but from a sustainability reporting perspective, what I often see is that the processes to gather sustainability information are highly manual, oftentimes using Excel or other kind of manual processes to compile and calculate the data. And so the processes and controls around it tend to be relatively immature compared to what we think about in the financial reporting space. And so I'm seeing a lot of companies now spend the time to really think about how can they leverage the process controls frameworks that they have in place from a financial reporting perspective and apply those same concepts and that same rigor to their sustainability information to really help them feel more confident and comfortable with the information that they're reporting. And also, honestly, just to be able to have that comfort for their own internal decision making as well, rather than just purely for reporting purposes.
Thank you for that. Would any other panelists like to jump in on the challenges and barriers for effective implementation of sustainability reporting?
As a corporate reporter, I think right now we're faced with the different frameworks, whether it's voluntary or mandatory. I've been in this space a while, 8 or 9 years. I'm not 100% sure, but it's at least 8 years, might be 9. And I would say practitioners 4 or 5 years ago, we were yearning for standardization, regulation. Regulation really, because when your internal stakeholders are asking you why is peer XYZ not reporting this and you're reporting this, you're like, oh, because we're using GRI and we get to choose if we're going to report it or not, but this other stakeholder is, and so this client X is asking for it, so I think we should. So when you could volunteer report, it wasn't always the same, and so I think we yearn for regulation, and now I think we're regretting that. Really, because even with regulation now, it's is it on or is it off constantly? People learned my name for the first time. I've been in Northern Trust 17 years, but they learned my name for the first time when the SEC first released their climate proposal. I've been looking. TCFD had been around before this, and so we have been reporting our greenhouse gas emissions as an organization for 10 years before this. But it was 2020, 2021 when the SEC comes out with their proposals that people started to pay attention, and so we started to ramp up. And our organization has now an ESG controller. We have a full team. Our greenhouse gas emissions were being calculated externally. We're in the process of transferring all of that back in-house. We've implemented new technology. We'll talk about some of that later. And then the SEC proposal went away. So we started to shift to, as a global organization, we started to look at the EU and CSRD reporting and try to get ready for that. And as I told someone over lunch, we were probably about 90% done with our report. And then the omnibus package got released that told us that we didn't really have to do that this year. So our biggest challenges are really trying to figure out which regulator is going to stick to their proposal. California, we're waiting on you to tell us, because California is another one that we are, again, ramping up for, but if anybody has to prepare California reporting, California hasn't released the final details of that report, and they don't expect to release it until November, but the report is due in January. And so we're internally trying to decide some no-go decisions, go or no-go, on whether or not we're going to try to once again to be in compliance with the regulation that's pending, a bill that has been passed, but final instructions haven't been made completely clear in this space. So I think, yeah, my biggest barrier is what I thought I wanted was regulation, but I think regulation is not as easy as we thought, and trying to make sure that we're keeping up with all the pending regulation and able to disclose when it's ready, but also not wanting to have to disclose, for example, 22 different regulations in the United States, because my company operates in 22 different states in the United States. So I'm hoping that we can come up with one standard, one golden standard that's going to satisfy a lot of different stakeholders.
Thank you for that. If I could ask you a follow-up, so then how do you think that is influencing the global corporate priorities?
The change in regulation.
The U.S. regulatory environment.
I think we're constantly changing priorities. I mean, what I was working on in January is not what I'm working on now. I'm actually trying to release my voluntary report because the CSRD omnibus package, but just last week someone told us, well, we might end up still being a wave one reporter, or we might need to report next week, and it was not a good meeting because I'm trying to get ready for California right now. So I think that teams are just having to be constantly adaptable, trying to, and companies need to probably at some point just make a decision which framework they want to follow, which stakeholders are going to be yelling the loudest about what it is they need and how they're going to be able to satisfy those requests.
Thank you so much for that perspective. Okay, so let's step a little forward. When we look at ensuring credibility and reliability, and Emily, maybe you can start us off with this one. How do you ensure the trustworthiness of sustainability reports, and what role does assurance play?
Yeah, so, I mean, I would, this seems a bit obvious coming from the assurance provider, but, you know, I definitely believe that assurance plays a really important role to enhance the credibility of information that's being reported and relied upon by a variety of stakeholders. And it's definitely increasing in prevalence. You know, I think we heard some statistics earlier about the significant increase in assurance that companies are getting over the last 10 years. A lot of the regulations are now requiring assurance in what I would refer to as limited assurance, so not quite to the level of a financial statement audit, but still a level of assurance nonetheless. And I really believe that trust is important, and you know, I think more and more stakeholders and investors, I believe, will continue to request assurance. We actually, PwC did a global investor survey in 2024, and 73% of investors think that companies' disclosures of sustainability metrics and KPIs should be assured at the same level as financial statement audits. So I think it just goes to show the importance of that assurance can play in really increasing and enhancing the reliability of information.
So during my master's program, I took a course on carbon accounting and corporate sustainability reporting. And one of our quiz questions was, how can you ensure that a sustainability report is credible? And it was to look for the assurance. So I agree with what you're saying. So then adding on to that, Jamie or Karan, would you add anything to that? How would you ensure the trustworthiness and, how do you ensure the trustworthiness of sustainability reports?
Here's the thing. We receive assurance over our greenhouse gas emissions, and I honestly think that's where you're going to find most corporations getting the assurance is over their greenhouse gas emissions. When I first started in this space, we were receiving assurance over our full sustainability report, again, a voluntary report. I think we're in a better place now to start ramping back up assurance because there's just much more better frameworks out there. I think that the challenge at the time, I'll tell you, it was the auditors and the lawyers. They don't agree. They don't agree. The lawyers are going to say don't disclose anything, and the assurance provider says this is what the disclosure is asking you to disclose, and you need to disclose it if you're going to be in compliance with it. And lawyers like, no, I don't think we have to really get that out there. So it became challenging. Actually, every year we would build this report, and our auditor and our legal team just couldn't get to an agreement. And so where the lawyers don't spend a lot of time is in the numbers, and there's a lot of numbers in greenhouse gas data, and so they don't really bother that statement. And so we're still able to get that data assured, and we think that that's, as a financial institution that is not full of scientists that do not specialize in greenhouse gas emissions, we should get that data assured. So we feel the most comfortable continuing to get that assured. What I would say is in lieu of assurance right now, because it's not mandatory in the type of reporting that we have to do, I think that's why you'll see a lot of companies have named an ESG controller and an ESG controller team. to try to let stakeholders know that they are trying to take the data as seriously as they would their typical financial reports. And so you'll start to see a lot more of those teams and individuals popping up at companies, which I find to be quite helpful, because if my team is front-ending doing the report, it is important for someone to come on the back end and help us think about having better controls over that data. We still argue a lot about the number of people that work at the company, and that's, because financial people use this number called FTE, and the rest of us use actual humans that work at the organization. We call them headcount, but having a controller in place, we're going to determine which one of those we're going to report going forward, and then we'll build an entire policy around which one goes into our report, so our stakeholders understand the number that's being disclosed. So, in lack of, if your company is not ready to move to full assurance, I do think that they can start building out at least a control function over this data so that it is ready to be assured when the regulation comes.
And then for us as an investor, I think there really is no way for us to, when we look at a sustainability report, know if that data is accurate or not. So we're really relying on companies to provide us with the best high quality data to provide assurance, because for us, what are we supposed to do? We're not at the company. We can't verify that. But there are a couple of things that we do to kind of sense check. So some things that we do is we obviously look at news reports, we look at third-party data providers, we'll look at information we get from other investors and groups to kind of put a sustainability report into context, right? But we'll also look at are there trends from year to year that the company is reporting? That can be really helpful. Or is the company for a few years reporting one metric and then changing the methodology or the metric? We might want to ask about why they decided to do that. Maybe there's a really good reason and they're improving their data collection, or maybe a certain metric makes them look better one year to the next. So those are things that we would want to ask about. We also will often meet with stakeholders and workers to get another perspective. And that's been really important and successful for us. So talking to employees, what is your experience at the company like? If a company discloses about their worker engagement and their surveys, and they have a whistleblower policy and they have really good processes in place for employees to come forward, then we might want to talk to employees and ask what does that look like in practice? And there's honestly, sometimes workers are really positive and sometimes they're not. So you'd be surprised how many times just by talking to workers from 3 different companies, you get a really good picture of who is performing well, where are the employees happy, where do they see these processes working well in practice, and where do they not. So that's not necessarily assurance or anything like that, but we try to contextualize a sustainability report in any way that we can.
Thank you all for those perspectives. We have to move topics a little bit, but for the audience, credibility, reliability, trustworthiness are fundamental pillars of the future of sustainability reporting. So I encourage you, if you have questions, please submit them for the Q&A at the end. But let's talk about technology and innovation. And Michael, maybe we can begin with you. What emerging technologies or innovations are shaping the future of sustainability reporting?
Well, nobody said AI yet, so I'll say AI. What's a panel without somebody talking about AI? So, but not in the way a lot of people think. I mean, obviously there's a lot of potential and promise on how AI is going to be deployed. Asset management is no different than any other sector. However, I think it needs to be placed in the proper perspective. AI is a tool, just like a microscope is a tool for a biologist. It allows you to see things that you wouldn't be able to see without it. It allows you to, in terms of building something that's scalable, do something in ways that you wouldn't with a team of scientists or analysts without the tool. But it's not a replacement for domain expertise. So, so this is, and this touches upon some of the earlier comments. Even around things like data integrity, hard science needs, and I'm advocating for my own profession, hard science needs a seat at the table. So I can just give a story that kind of underscores this. So, 2021, 2022, I was working for an asset manager, and this is when the SEC was going to develop a new set of regulations for particularly physical climate disclosure around emissions, both CO2 and methane. And there's a initial public discourse period. There's a request for comments, goes back, things are revised. A second request for comments comes out. Once it got through, and what was actually going to become, eventually part of legislation and part of what, what auditors would be using as guidelines, there were sentences that we submitted that were not even changed, word for word. Sentences that we provided to the auditors, made it into what will be at some point an enforceable regulation. The reason I highlight that is because, unlike if you think about the FDA, you think about food and drug, you think about things that we ingest. These are highly, highly regulated industries. But the air that we breathe is actually very unregulated in comparison, right? So, which is ironic when 1 in 8 deaths in the world has a link to air pollution, yet this is probably, in terms of the things that we interact with, whether we ingest food, drugs, medicine, again, what we breathe, this is the least regulated of anything. So, unlike the FDA, unlike other regulatory bodies that have domain experts, sitting across the table with auditors and lawyers, they're almost viewed as consultants in this space, and I think that is one thing that needs to change. And that will change with ways to demonstrate the efficacy of the data, and this is where AI can be useful. It's not going to give an answer, but it allows us to look through a variety of combinations of how data is generated, what the data actually means, and ultimately how this can be put in a context where capital will be deployed behind it. That needs that layer of domain expertise, which I think is sorely lacking here. So it's not just technology, it's how can we use technology in the right way with the right subject matter experts that are going to deploy it in a way that I think is beneficial for both the regulator as well as the investor. And there's a long way to go in that space. I mean, again, as we were talking about earlier, the data integrity space, there's a massive opportunity there. There's an equal opportunity here. We are seeing, and I'll just note, JP Morgan, they have actually hired, a chief climate advisor, Sarah Kapnick, who was NOAA's chief scientist under the Biden administration. She actually is heading a climate division at JP Morgan. So that's a step in the right direction. You want to see, not just a figurehead, but somebody that actually has scientific expertise, both on the science side and the asset management side, kind of leading that climate piece and sitting around the table with other investors. So, that's only one bank of many when you think of kind of the bulge bracket banks, but hopefully we see more of that. But I think that's a step in the right direction. I hope other banks will follow.
Thank you for that perspective. Anyone else?
Well, I fully agree with what Michael just said. And so now with all the AI and machine learning technologies, some scientists start to combine satellite, sensor, and utility logistics data to better estimate Scope 3 emissions along the supply chain. Also, a bunch of researchers, including myself, start to use a large language model, ChatGPT, to extract useful information from typically over 100-page ESG reports, very complicated, to extract the most important information and to better predict their future sustainability performance. So I agree with Michael, the AI, machine learning, all the new innovations in technology side are going to really shape the future.
I think we're seeing some of that. I think it's moving in the right direction. I mean, there are a lot of vendors out there that are peddling garbage, and any company can slap AI in their company name, and all of a sudden they're going to have funding, and people are thinking because there's AI embedded in the process that it's scientifically defensible, when in fact it's the opposite. There might be nice science projects, but a nice science project is not the same thing as a commercially viable business that you want to build a regulatory framework on top of. So I think as those that are evaluating the technologies, this needs to be part of the DDQs, that DDQ process, which is not just evaluating the data, but you're evaluating the companies that are providing and auditing the data. And I think we're seeing movement, but there's still a lot of opportunity to I think, course correct this in a direction that's more beneficial.
Yeah, I find that so interesting because even from an academic perspective, I have seen how my university has navigated. How do we allow students to use AI and keep the academic integrity? How is it helpful? How is it harmful? So it's interesting to see that like business and corporate and others are dealing with that as well. So maybe that's a good segue to the next category. So the role of education and research. And for this one, I will direct it to Professor Wei and to Jamie. How can education and academic research support the development of sustainability reporting?
Well, I think we already talked about the research side, about how researchers can develop better frameworks, measurement methods, and tools to better predict, to measure sustainability performance. So I will focus on education side for now. On the education side, we do see a huge gap between the demand for sustainability reporting and the supply of sustainability expertise like you. So at Geese College of Business, we try to fill the gap by offering classes that teach students of the major sustainability standards, materiality framework like GRI and SASB, and teach students how to connect and to measure, to verify, to, like what Michael says, to think carefully about data quality issue about related to sustainability, and also to encourage the student to think more critically or broadly about the trade-off between financial and sustainability goals. Sometimes you have to make a trade-off. And finally, also to teach students how to communicate their ESG insights more effectively through data visualization and structured reporting and written narrative. So that's basically what we're doing, our efforts. We believe by improving students' sustainability literacy, they will become more accountable, responsible business leaders in the future. Now I turn to Jim.
As a student, I appreciate the answer so much. Jamie, what would you add to that?
I agree. I think that I feel like I'm able to hire a lot more people now with sustainability backgrounds. That I do not have a background in sustainability, but most of the people on my team do. So I think that academia has come a long way in providing opportunities. Where I think that there's still room to grow is, I think it just needs to be embedded in more sectors within academia. I think we often still see it embedded only in environmental programs or only in scientific programs within the university. And I think that we need to be thinking about how to cross-train people who are coming up in technology, who are in the business school. You still don't see a lot of MBA tracks. You see some, but some MBA tracks that have sort of a sustainability focus for people. So I just think that there's opportunity there. It's hard when you're only looking in one school, and even if it's in the environmental or scientific programs, how do you embed some of the corporate business knowledge or technology knowledge into those programs so that those students are able to just be more adaptable when they actually are entering the workforce?
Thank you for that. So, as I said at the beginning of this panel, one sector cannot solve the evolution of sustainability reporting on its own. All sectors have to come together. And my last question for each panelist, and I would love if all of you could answer this, is when it comes to that cross-sector collaboration, how can academic, corporations, investors, and assurance firms work together to improve sustainability reporting?
I can start out. I think there's a lot of organizations and nonprofits that are working to set standards for disclosure, where there's opportunity for people from all kinds of backgrounds to get involved. So I think the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was really, really effective, and it's been adopted by some countries as like a reporting standard for corporations. And I know that they had opportunities for public comments from anyone really who's interested in commenting on their disclosure standard, but they also often have advisory councils and groups where corporations and investors and academics can get involved. And there's other similar organizations that are looking at different topics. So there's the Task Force for Inequality and Social-Related Financial Disclosures and the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures that are kind of actively developing standards right now. And I think that's a really good opportunity for all of us to provide input and to get involved.
Thank you for that. Jamie, anything you would add?
I also think that convenings like this, I think that, again, years ago, when you'd go to this, you would only see sustainability practitioners. You wouldn't have the government sector. You wouldn't have academia there. Academia would have their own conferences or congresses. You know, the corporate would have their own government institutions. And so I'm starting to see more opportunities for cross-collaboration. I think actually the first time I met our state treasurer was at Aspen ESG Inaugural Summit, for example. And so that was one of the first times that I saw government, academia, corporate be in spaces together. And I think that more of those convenings are starting to take place here in North America, and I think it's important because this is where some of the conversations will happen.
Thank you. Michael, anything you would add?
Yeah, I mean, along a similar vein, I mean, I think a lot is, you know, the encouragement of people to get PhDs and not just pursue an academic career. We're starting to see this shift a little bit, particularly in the sciences, but there's still, again, room to grow in that space. I think if you start from, you know, instead of pushing from the academy outward, you know, I think I've been involved in a lot of these accelerator programs where companies are actually working with graduate students and bringing their problems to the schools, and they're crafting either a master's project or a PhD, even, you know, as far as a PhD, out of things that are really rooted in a real commercial problem. I think that's a change. I don't think we saw as much of that a few years ago, and I think this space in particular really needs that. So again, we're moving in that direction, but I think the more we can actually bring the private sector, you know, particularly the investment world or the technology developers, you know, into earlier stages of graduate studies, and you know, not just a terminal master's degree, but even, you know, it's, you know, support some of these students through PhD programs. I mean, I knew very early in my program, you know, I wanted to be academic. After my first semester, I realized I didn't, but I still went through it, understanding that there was a different path. And but when I did that, it was less common. I think now it's more common, it's more accepted. But I think, you know, having a seat at the table, a lot of it was just luck in terms of people that you cross paths with. But getting industry to really get involved with, you know, the germination of graduate students that they know are going to take that path into the private sector, and, you know, in that way you're working on a PhD thesis that actually has real world impact right away, as opposed to, you know, a dissertation that's going to sit on the shelf somewhere and very few people are going to read it. So,
Thank you. And then Emily and Professor Wei, bring us home.
Yep. I'll just quickly add on to what Karen was saying too, that I think that it's really important, you know, a number of these organizations that are setting new standards, new regulations, they do each have their own due process where they need to, and are required to solicit feedback from the community and from stakeholders, users, preparers, to understand what are the pros, cons, challenges, benefits for what they're proposing that companies would need to report. And so I do think, as we think about all these different groups here, you know, inputting into that process and providing that feedback on what is the usefulness of this information that you're asking companies to report. Like, will you actually use it as an investor or not? You know, is it something that's overly burdensome to prepare, or is it relatively straightforward? So I think there's a great opportunity for each of these different groups here to input into that process to really make sustainability reporting and the information that companies have to prepare as useful as possible.
Well, I guess I hope at the university level we could create more interdisciplinary type of programs that combine accounting, data science, environment, social science, public policy, all the expertise together. That's requires huge effort, by the way. Also requires all the panelists here, investors, asset managers, and assurers, maybe at some time to share your valuable time with us to help us set up such programs. It's a great effort, but I see the huge benefits. Maybe that's a message to the president.
Well, thank you. We are in the last few minutes of this panel, and just to summarize key takeaways, you have all just heard from a brilliant and talented and exceptional panelist. And if they all go their own way, they're going to go pretty far. But if they all team up and go together, imagine how much further they will go. And when we look at future generations, they deserve that collaboration. So thank you all. And with that, I would like to give you all just one final opportunity. What is the last thing that you'd like to leave our audience with? What is maybe something that you weren't able to share that you wanted to, or just your closing message? And Professor Wei, maybe we can go this way first and begin with you.
Do we have our Q&A, or we just find us on?
Oh.
Yeah. Do you want to
Yeah.
questions?
Okay, actually, let's move to questions.
Do you need help?
I love that there are so many questions. Okay. So the first question was submitted by Annie. Emissions are rising, ecosystems are declining, and future generations remain at risk. What will it take to move from reporting to requiring accountability? How can we drive policy change and business transformation rather than just ticking boxes? This is a tough question, but I'm happy that it was asked because it brings it into the real world applications. Would anyone like to jump in for this?
I can start. I think if we're honest, the accountability piece, it really has to get to, again, not to use a buzzword, but resilience and resilient investing has become kind of common parlance in the space where it wasn't even talked about a few years ago. And a lot of these net zero programs, I mean, and I'm being very blunt, we're in the process of blowing through that target. So the 1.5 degree target really doesn't exist. And if we're trying to do not just the investment world, but everyone on the planet who is involved in eating, drinking, or breathing, which is everybody, trying to stick to a target that we've already blown through is not doing anybody any justice. So I think we need to be real about constructing flexible pathways. We're not saying not saying at all to ignore net zero targets or what's behind that, but equally important, if not more important, is really how to adapt to a future that we don't even understand that well. So, targets are important. You need guidelines. Nobody's saying that the continued proliferation of emissions is not a big deal, but the reality is this is a world that has been created that we have to live with and respond to, and steering more capital towards how we're going to build a flexible, global commercial and societal system that both grows and evolves with this future is important, and I think it's irresponsible to think otherwise. So again, I'm not at all dismissing net zero targets, but I think they're kind of short-sighted, and I think we have to bring a little bit more a dose of reality based on the world that we live in now.
I think all of us have a small part to play in ensuring that we're on the right path. So something that we do at the Treasurer's Office is that we will try to hold companies accountable when they publish a net zero report. So we will have follow-up conversations. We ask them to provide us with updates. We ask them to publish updates on, for example, setting interim targets so that you don't have just a big net zero target at the end, but we want to see incremental change, and we want to have those conversations with companies. Are you on track? If you're not on track, what are your barriers maybe? One thing that we've started asking companies is, if you don't think you can meet your net zero target, are there any policy changes that you need? And are you advocating for those policy changes? And a lot of times I think the answer is no. So there's many different smaller things that we can do. Another thing I would encourage everyone, if you are at an organization that has an endowment, or you provide a 401k, or you invest money in some way, start asking your plan providers, are they considering sustainability? Do they have sustainability options? Maybe ask your internal investment team, do you consider sustainability in your investment processes? Because I think a lot of times we're maybe not thinking about these things. If you're an organization that has money that's somehow being invested, or you provide a retirement plan, you have an area of influence and you can use that. And a lot of times that's not really what happens. So I think that small steps from many different angles that are needed, and probably policy change.
I know I'm not a panelist, but I would just love to add, one of the biggest things that I took away from my master's program is that it comes down to the people. And that's twofold. The people who are in an organization asking questions and demanding it from the inside, but also the consumers. And that falls onto consumer education, so that consumers can demand more sustainable actions. Either way. Okay, another question we got is, beyond accountability and communication alone, can any of the panelists provide an example of an instance where they sought research insight on any sustainability aspect of their work?
Well, I can add something here. So when we're studying our field, look at the public company's commitment to ratio and gender diversity. So a lot of firms make public commitments. So they want gender diverse to be 50%. And they often fail to follow that path. So what they say generally don't want to match what they do. So that's basically some of the evidence we see in the study. And we also seen that a lot of firms, when they talk about their carbon emissions, they talk about internal training, volunteering, some operational tools, but they talk very little about their green R&D and green products. So when we see those scenarios, in general, those companies try to hide their bad performance, do greenwashing, they end up with more carbon emission toxic release than those firms that focus on green R&D. So probably some of the evidence I have seen in my work. There's only 30 seconds now.
Okay, 30 seconds. Let's get one final question in. Okay, a question from Alicia. For the future of sustainability reporting, my biggest concern is the current lack of federal funding or just general support for sustainability-related research in the U.S. If there is severely limited funding for research, there will be little to report on. What are your suggestions or thoughts around this statement? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
I think that's a question.
I agree. I think, if anything, start businesses that are addressing the commercial needs. If the funding situation reverses, that's great, but every job that was eliminated provides a commercial opportunity for somebody to fill the need of something that is affecting a company's balance sheet. So it's a great time to be an entrepreneur in this space.
Thank you for that. And with that, I think we are at time. I would like to thank our panelists again. Could we please give them a round of applause? Thank you everyone so much for attending. Good job, everybody.
Great moderator.
Thank you.
Well, you did an amazing job.
thank you.
Who taught you the sustainable reporting?